In 1955, Dorothy Dandridge became the first black woman ever nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actress. And on the same night, she presented an award on that stage, another first no one had done before her. The industry had validated her in the most formal way it knew how. But the country surrounding that industry had not moved at the same pace. Black performers in 1955 could sell out venues, headline hotel showrooms, and appear on magazine covers, and still be directed to separate entrances, barred from the rooms their fans ate in and turned away from the hotels where their names were on the marquee. Dandridge had climbed higher than any black actress before her. The doors that opened for her career and the doors she was actually permitted to walk through were not always the same doors. Dorothy Jean Dandridge was born on November 9, 1922, in Cleveland, Ohio, to Ruby Dandridge, an actress who would later become a character player in Hollywood, and Cyril Dandridge, a cabinet maker who left the family before Dorothy could form memories of him. Ruby was ambitious, controlling, and frequently absent in ways that mattered while present in ways that left marks. She formed her daughters into a performing act called the Wonder Children, before Dorothy was old enough to have chosen it herself. Dorothy and her sister Vivian performed in churches and community halls across the South, traveling a circuit of black audiences who responded to the act with genuine warmth and who represented for Dorothy her earliest experience of being seen and valued on a stage. The circuit also introduced her, before she was 10 years old, to the geography of American segregation. Which water fountains, which waiting rooms, which sections of which theaters. The performance was always shadowed by the logistics of where the performers were allowed to go afterward. By her early teens, Dorothy was in Los Angeles, where Ruby had relocated the family to pursue her own career. Hollywood in the late 1930s had work for black performers, but the work was specific. It was maids and mammies and figures in the background whose presence was meant to provide texture rather than story. Dorothy Dandridge, even at 14 and 15, was obviously not a background figure. She had a quality that cameras responded to immediately, a stillness that read as depth, eyes that held attention without effort. MGM noticed her early and cast her in small parts, and small parts in MGM films in the late 1930s and early 1940s meant appearances in pictures that white audiences watched in mainstream theaters where Dorothy Dandridge herself, had she paid for a ticket, would have been directed to the balcony. She appeared in Four Shall Die in 1940, in Lady from Louisiana in 1941, in Bahama Passage and Drums of the Congo in 1942. She sang with the Mills Brothers and recorded her own material. She married Harold Nicholas of the Nicholas Brothers Tap Dancing Act in 1942, a marriage that was genuinely affectionate and genuinely difficult, and in 1943 she gave birth to a daughter named Harolyn. Harolyn was brain damaged from birth, the result of oxygen deprivation during delivery, and her care would remain the most significant financial and emotional weight of Dorothy Dandridge's life until the end of it. Harold Nicholas found the situation impossible to sustain. The marriage collapsed, formally ending in 1951, though it had been functionally over for years before the paperwork was filed. The years between her mid-20s and her early 30s were the years when Dorothy Dandridge rebuilt. She hired a manager named Earl Mills, who would remain close to her for the rest of her life, and who would later write a book about her that is one of the primary sources for understanding how she experienced the period. She developed a nightclub act. The act was exceptional. She performed in the most prestigious venues in the country, including the Empire Room at the Waldorf Astoria in New York and the Last Frontier Hotel in Las Vegas, and her performances there were received by critics in terms that placed her among the best cabaret performers of her generation. Frank Sinatra sat in her audiences. Jack Kennedy reportedly sent her flowers. The rooms were full of people who had never seen anything quite like her, and who left the performances genuinely moved. At the Last Frontier Hotel in Las Vegas, Dorothy Dandridge was not permitted to stay in her room between sets. She performed in the showroom, received standing ovations, and then walked to whatever accommodation had been arranged for her off the property because the hotel did not allow black guests to use the pool, the casino, or the rooms. Las Vegas in the early 1950s operated under a system of informal but absolute segregation that applied even to the headliners whose names were on the marquees. Lena Horne had experienced the same conditions earlier. Nat King Cole would encounter explicit hostility when he attempted to buy a home in a white Los Angeles neighborhood in 1954. The pattern was consistent and documented and largely unremarked upon in the mainstream press, which was more interested in the performances than in what happened when the performances ended. Carmen Jones arrived in 1954. Otto Preminger, who had directed Laura and had a reputation for making pictures that the studios found commercially and sometimes morally difficult, had acquired the rights to the Oscar Hammerstein II stage production, a modernization of the Bizet opera Carmen with an all-black cast. The original Broadway production had starred Muriel Smith and Muriel Rahn alternating in the lead role. Preminger wanted someone different for the film, someone whose physical presence would sustain a story about a woman whose erotic power over men is the engine of the plot. He screen-tested dozens of women and found that most of them could project either the sexuality or the emotional weight, but not both simultaneously. Dorothy Dandridge could project both. She could also project the thing that is harder to name, which is the specific quality of a person who is fully present in a scene, who is not merely acting the emotion, but inhabiting it in a way that the camera records differently. Preminger cast her, and then, reportedly, fell in love with her. The nature of their relationship is documented incompletely, but the general outline is clear from multiple sources. They were romantically involved during the production. The involvement was intense and unequal in the ways that relationships between directors and leading actresses during studio-era Hollywood were structurally predisposed to be unequal. And it ended in a way that left Dorothy Dandridge with material and emotional losses and Otto Preminger with a film that made approximately $5 million on a budget of around $1 million. The film opened in October 1954 to critical responses that focused almost entirely on Dandridge, who was described in terms that reviewers reached for and then found inadequate. Bosley Crowther in the New York Times wrote that she gave a performance of genuine power. Time magazine put her on its cover, one of the earliest appearances of a black woman on that cover in a context other than news reporting. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences nominated her for Best Actress. Grace Kelly won for The Country Girl. The nomination was significant and the loss was unsurprising. What is worth examining carefully, because it illuminates something about how the film industry managed its relationship to black talent in this period, is what the nomination actually meant in practical terms for Dorothy Dandridge's career. A Best Actress nomination should function as a kind of guarantee. It signals to producers and studios that the performer has been validated by the industry's own internal credentialing system, that audiences and critics have confirmed the commercial and artistic value of the work, that future projects should be forthcoming. For white nominees who did not win, the nomination typically led to more and better offers within 12 to 24 months. For Dorothy Dandridge, the immediate aftermath of the nomination was a quiet but systematic failure of opportunity. The studios were not certain what to do with a black leading actress in 1955. The categories they had were not designed to accommodate her. She was too recognizably a lead for the supporting and background roles that were considered appropriate for black performers. She was not white, which meant that the love stories and romantic comedies and domestic dramas that were the primary vehicles for white leading actresses were not available to her in any straightforward way. The pictures that could have been built for her, that should have been built for her, given her demonstrated box office value and critical standing, were not built. Island in the Sun in 1956, which paired her with John Justin in a story involving interracial romance, was considered so potentially controversial that it was handled cautiously and nervously, even by the standards of a studio that understood it was making a picture about something audiences were not used to seeing. The Decks Ran Red in 1958 was a modest thriller. Porgy and Bess in 1959 was another Preminger production, and the experience of making it was difficult in ways that recapitulated many of the difficulties of their earlier professional relationship. The financial dimension of this period is important and is sometimes omitted from accounts that focus primarily on the cultural significance of Dandridge's career. She was earning substantial money from her nightclub work in the early and mid-1950s. But the management of that money was not in her control in ways that she understood clearly at the time. She trusted people whose interests were not aligned with hers. She invested in an oil venture that failed catastrophically, losing approximately $150,000 that she did not have in reserve. She signed contracts that were not in her favor and did not have the legal representation that might have caught the problematic clauses before signing. These are not unusual facts about a performer of her era and background. The entertainment industry in the 1950s was structured in ways that routinely disadvantaged artists, particularly artists who were not from backgrounds that provided financial literacy and legal access. But the losses accelerated. By the late 1950s, she was working more to recover from deficits than to build forward. She married Jack Dennison in 1959. Dennison was a white restaurateur who managed a supper club in Los Angeles. The marriage was troubled from early on. Dennison's restaurant failed, and the failure cost Dorothy Dandridge money she had not intended to spend. The relationship had qualities that the word troubled does not adequately describe, and accounts from people close to her during this period suggest that it was isolating in ways that compounded the professional difficulties she was already navigating. The marriage ended in 1962. She filed for bankruptcy in 1963, listing assets of about $2,000 in debts that were more than 100 times that amount. The bankruptcy filing is one of the more precisely documented facts of her final years, and it sits in difficult juxtaposition with what she had been and done. 8 years before filing for bankruptcy, she was on the cover of Time magazine. She was the first Black woman nominated for Best Actress. She had performed at the Waldorf Astoria. She had made a film that grossed $5 million. The distance between those facts and the bankruptcy filing is not explained by anything as simple as personal failure. It is explained in part by the structural conditions that surrounded her career at every point, the ways in which the industry had no real place for her that it was willing to build and hold open, the ways in which the financial systems around her routed money away from her rather than toward her, the ways in which the romantic and professional relationships she entered were with men who had more structural power than she did and who used it. She was working in the early 1960s, still performing, still taking roles where they were available. There were television appearances. There were engagements in smaller venues than the ones she had headlined at her peak. There was a projected comeback, managed by people who believed in her talent and who were trying to assemble the pieces. She was in discussions about projects that might have re-established her visibility. She was taking antidepressants and other medications that her doctors had prescribed for the anxiety and depression that had been present, at varying intensities, for much of her adult life. On September 8, 1965, Dorothy Dandridge was found dead in her apartment in West Hollywood. She was 42 years old. The official finding was an accidental overdose of an antidepressant called tofranil, known generically as imipramine. The drug had a narrow therapeutic window and was prescribed for the depression that had been deepening over the preceding years. Whether the overdose was truly accidental or whether it was intentional is a question that was raised at the time and that her biographers have since examined at length without arriving at a definitive answer. The medical examiner's report said accidental. Earl Mills, who knew her better than almost anyone, believed it was accidental and said so directly and with evident conviction. Others who were close to her were less certain. What is certain is that she died alone in her apartment with a fractured metatarsal bone in her foot from an injury she had sustained recently, and with approximately $2 in her bank account. Her daughter, Harolyn, outlived her. Harolyn had been placed in a care facility in California, a placement that Dorothy Dandridge had arranged and paid for, and which had consumed a substantial portion of her earnings over the years. The fear that there would be no money to continue. Harolyn's care was one of the documented anxieties of her final period. After Dorothy's death, the state of California assumed responsibility for Harolyn's care. She lived in state facilities for decades. She died in 2003. The retrospective recognition of Dorothy Dandridge has been substantial and has arrived in waves. Halle Berry, accepting the Best Actress Oscar for Monsters Ball in 2002, invoked Dandridge's name explicitly in her acceptance speech, describing her as one of the women whose work had made that moment possible. Berry had also played Dorothy Dandridge in an HBO biopic in 1999 for which she won a Golden Globe. The United States Postal Service issued a commemorative stamp bearing Dandridge's image. Books have been written, documentaries produced, retrospective screenings organized. The Hollywood Walk of Fame includes her star. The retrospective recognition is genuine, and the people offering it are sincere. It is also worth observing that retrospective recognition operates in a particular way with figures like Dorothy Dandridge, who died at 42 with $2 in her account after a decade of professional and financial decline that followed directly from the conditions the industry imposed on her. The recognition arrives after the person is no longer there to receive it, after the material harm has been done and cannot be undone, after the question of what her career might have been if the industry had treated her as it treated actresses of comparable talent and commercial value cannot be answered with anything other than speculation. The stamp and the Walk of Fame, star, are real honors. They do not change what happened. What happened is documented in enough detail to be stated plainly. Dorothy Dandridge was one of the most talented performers in American entertainment in the 1950s. This was not a contested view among the people who saw her work, including critics, audiences, and industry professionals who had extensive experience evaluating performers. Her nomination for Best Actress was a validation of something that was already obvious to most people who had seen Carmen Jones. The film she made with Otto Preminger was a commercial success. She was a nightclub performer of the first rank who could fill the most prestigious rooms in the country. The Las Vegas hotels that hired her to fill their showrooms did not allow her to use those showrooms' facilities as a guest. This was standard practice in Las Vegas in the early 1950s, and it applied to Lena Horne and to Sammy Davis Jr., and to Nat King Cole, and to most of the black headliners who were building the entertainment identity of a city that would not have been what it was without them. The arrangement required a particular kind of internal management from the performers, a capacity to sustain the performance of belonging while navigating the infrastructure of exclusion that surrounded it. Dorothy Dandridge managed it. She performed brilliantly in rooms that treated her as a visitor rather than a guest. She gave interviews in which she was gracious and controlled. She accepted the terms that were available to her because refusing them would have meant not performing at all. The film opportunities that should have followed her Oscar nomination did not materialize in the volume or quality that her standing warranted. This is not a matter of retrospective interpretation. It was noted at the time, including in the black press, which covered Dorothy Dandridge's career with consistent attention and which periodically asked in print why the studios were not making more pictures with her. The answer was not that the audience wasn't there. Carmen Jones had demonstrated the audience. The answer was that the infrastructure of the studio system in the mid-1950s was not designed to build vehicles for black leading actresses, and was not going to build them at the pace her talent justified simply because her talent was obvious. The people who managed her money in ways that did not serve her interests were not necessarily malicious. Some of them probably believed they were doing their best for her. But the financial education and legal access that might have protected her were not things she had been positioned to acquire. The entertainment industry in that era was filled with performers of all backgrounds who were financially exploited by managers, agents, and studios who operated in an environment of significant information asymmetry. Black performers were exploited in those ways and also in ways specific to their position. With fewer alternative paths, fewer advocates within the system, fewer structural protections. The marriage to Jack Dennison is the part of the story where the specific details matter most and are least clearly documented. What is documented is that the marriage cost her money she did not have in ways she did not fully understand when she entered into it. That it was not a relationship that provided her with stability or support during a professionally difficult period, and that its end left her in a worse material position than its beginning. These facts are consistent across multiple accounts from people who were close to her during that period and who spoke or wrote about it after her death. The more specific claims about the nature of the relationship are contested enough that attributing them with confidence is not possible from the available record. The depression that was present through much of her life was a real condition that required medical management and did not consistently receive it in forms that worked. Antidepressant pharmacology in 1965 was in an early phase, and the drugs available were difficult to manage precisely. Imipramine, the drug that killed her, was effective for many patients and had a toxicity profile that made dosing errors dangerous. Whether the dose that killed her was the result of an error or an intention is something the available record does not resolve. What the record shows is that she was 42 years old, alone, in financial crisis, physically injured, and on medication for a condition that had been worsening for years. The Life magazine photographs from 1954 are extraordinary. She is wearing a strapless gown, and the expression on her face is the expression of someone who knows they are being photographed and has long since moved past self-consciousness about it, who can meet the camera as an equal. She looks like exactly what she was, a woman at the height of her power, recognized and celebrated and aware of the recognition. The photographs circulated widely. They appeared in a magazine that was read by millions of Americans, including millions who would not have watched her perform and would not have been in the audiences for her films. They made her image part of the national visual vocabulary in a way that individual performances, however well reviewed, could not. The photographs also appeared in the same year as the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education, which ruled that racially segregated public schools were unconstitutional. The country was moving in the specific legal and formal sense, away from the explicit structures of segregation that had governed Dorothy Dandridge's entire life. The movement was real, and its effects were real. It was also incomplete, contested, and slow in ways that made its relevance to the daily conditions of her life in 1954 and 1955 and 1956 complicated to assess. The formal legal structures were changing. The informal structures, the ones that determined which door she used to enter the Pantages Theater and which rooms she was allowed to occupy in the hotels where she headlined, were not changing at the same pace. Oscar Night, 1955, has a specific texture that is worth holding on to. The ceremony was held at the RKO Pantages Theater in Hollywood. The nominees in the Best Actress category were Judy Garland for A Star is Born, Audrey Hepburn for Sabrina, Jane Wyman for Magnificent Obsession, Grace Kelly for The Country Girl, and Dorothy Dandridge for Carmen Jones. Of these 5 women, Dorothy Dandridge was the only one who had not been permitted to stay in hotels she performed in, who had entered venues through service entrances, who had been managed in the ways that American racial segregation managed black public figures in public spaces. She was also the only one for whom the nomination itself represented a structural first, a breach in a category that had been previously and entirely closed to people of her background. The other nominees were competing for the award. Dorothy Dandridge was also competing against the history of the award. Grace Kelly won, as she was widely expected to. The choice was not controversial at the time in the way that it might be discussed now. Kelly's performance was strong and her campaign was well managed, and the industry had known her for several years in a series of pictures that had built consistent goodwill. Dorothy Dandridge's loss was noted in the black press with a combination of genuine disappointment and recognition that the nomination itself was a significant development, that the industry had done something it had never done before, that whatever came next was different from what had come before. That framing was accurate as far as it went. What it could not fully account for was what came next in practice, which was the set of conditions I have been describing. Her story has been told many times in the 60 years since her death, and the telling has generally emphasized the triumph of the nomination and the tragedy of the final years, with the two ends of the narrative joined by a story of individual vulnerability and bad luck and difficult circumstances. That telling is not wrong. The circumstances were difficult. The decisions made around her were sometimes bad. The luck was, at several critical moments, genuinely bad. But the architecture underneath the individual story, the set of structural conditions that shaped what was available to her and what was not, what was possible and what was foreclosed, is the part that individual-centered narratives tend to treat as background, when it was actually the operating system that everything else ran on. She was not the only black performer of her generation to navigate these conditions. She was not even the only one to navigate them while achieving a degree of success and recognition that the conditions seemed designed to prevent. Lena Horne navigated them for a longer career and, in some respects, a more financially stable outcome, partly because of differences in how she managed her finances and partly because of structural differences in how the industry positioned her. Harry Belafonte navigated them and built a career that extended across decades. Sidney Poitier navigated them and won a Best Actor Oscar in 1964, 9 years after Dorothy Dandridge's nomination, becoming the first black man to win in that category. These facts are not evidence that the structural conditions did not exist. They are evidence that some individuals found paths through those conditions that others did not find, and that the finding of paths was not simply a matter of talent, since Dorothy Dandridge's talent was not at issue. What she left behind is a body of work that is smaller than it should be and more durable than the conditions of its creation might have suggested. Carmen Jones remains, 70 years after its release, a film of genuine power, and her performance in it is the primary reason. The nightclub performances are documented in recordings and in the accounts of people who saw them and who described them with a consistency that is itself evidence. The Life magazine photographs remain. The first nomination for Best Actress by a black woman in Academy history remains. She used the side entrance. She sang the songs. She held the room. She was brilliant in the ways that are hardest to fake. In front of cameras and in front of live audiences and in small theaters and in large ones. In pictures that deserved her and in pictures that did not. The industry she worked in was not designed to sustain what she could do, and it did not sustain it. She died at 42 with $2 in her account. The stamp came later. So did the recognition, the retrospective screenings, the Halle Berry speech, the documentaries, the biographies. Dorothy Dandridge received most of what she deserved at a delay she did not survive.